Network Automation Nerds podcast. Hi guys, Eric Cho here. Just want to let you guys know for this podcast episode, the first portion was recorded outside with Jaime, in which you could find the full episode in the link below. However, when we were recording outside, the video didn't come out too well, and therefore the video that you're about to see was only after we came back home and we were able to record it on screen. However, I hope you still enjoyed the video. Now, back to the show. All right. Thanks for getting back to me, Jaime. You might have noticed that the background noise is gone.
It's
And
gone.
the kids
Well,
are not running in the background anymore.
on your side, maybe on my side, there's still like background
Yeah,
noise.
yeah. My family are not here, but different kids though, right?
Yeah,
Like there was like some
yeah,
toddlers that were just running in the background because a sucker like I actually forgot to bring extra batteries. I would say, like, I don't know what it is, but I think those GoPro 10s sucked out batteries faster than the previous generation. But that's no excuse, right? Like, I bought everything but batteries. So Jaime, being the nice guy that he was, we both rushed home, hop hop on the computer, and trying to wrap this up. So thank you for bearing with me, and
no
you're a good
problem, buddy.
friend.
I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we were just having a nice conversation, catching up for some. I mean, we are having catch up for some time now, so I think it's a
Yeah.
good opportunity to catch up, right? So,
Yeah, I agree. It was just like we haven't seen each other for a while. And for example, I didn't know, you were not born in Mexico. You were just like, raised there. And so that was
yeah.
good to know. And a lot of stuff that I hadn't even thought about in years. For example, you were talking about the presentation that you did for the CI/CD on DevNet Create,
Hmm.
which was 2020. I remember that because it was virtual, but you were
Hmm.
talking about kind of the origin of that, right? Like 2019, you were
Hmm.
at DevNet Create, you talked to a lot of people and so on. So why don't you tell us, like, how did that presentation came about and how did it actually, you made it happen in production and they're still using it, right? Like 2 years after you left.
Yeah. So, oh, there's a there's a cool thing. One, I would say we knew like, okay, this is we want to get to manage the infrastructure in a more efficient, effective way.
Yep.
I mean, back then there was we were um, engineers were basically CLI devices, making config in the base of knowledge. And many times they say, "What's the latest template?" Okay, the latest template is the whatever last device they connected to, right? And
Yeah.
that's what
Whatever is
they,
in
yeah,
production or whatever
yeah.
is on Jaime's laptop.
Yeah, whatever is in the last device that I know has kind of a my best understanding a good config looks like.
Right.
And that really depends what engineer was touching device. You can end with some situation that, as I said before, like just it's a booby trap for someone else in the future, right? So
Right.
we knew that, and I think the other part was to learn from the other team because automation was not I mean, it was not a new thing at Riot. Like many teams were doing automation in different part of their services, infrastructure,
Right.
etc. So I did spend a significant amount of time understanding their use cases, um, the gaps that they had, the lessons learned from those, right?
Right.
In order to kind of have a better understanding. And when I knew that it's not about because there's always this thing like, oh, don't recreate the wheel, right? There's a bunch of solution already that the company already has, and but for me it was okay. I don't know if those solutions are the right fit for our needs or use cases.
Right.
So so I didn't go blindly just use whatever other team were using. For example, there was team that was they developed their system mostly to help them build new data centers. Okay,
Right.
um, and they decide on some technologies uh, like Ansible, etc. But those were not the problem for me. The problem for me was like, okay, I need a system that is not only to build, for example, new pop, but I want something that help us manage the day to day, right?
Right.
Uh, so because you think about software, that's what they do, right? They when they have a live service, they always developing new feature, new fixing bugs, etc. And those things are moving in their pipeline in a daily basis, right? Uh, People don't build software once and leave it and put it in production and that's it, right? So there's a
And more importantly, when people ask what is the latest code, they don't go into production and look at
yeah,
the code. They
exactly.
actually look at the repo.
Yeah, so already they have very good practice, and so I want to learn from those and see
Right.
how we implement those in some extent, right? Because we were also limited in terms of resources. Um, the other thing that we quickly learned was that uh, I needed software engineer at least one to work in this project, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and use those two, like, okay, I understand the use cases and they understand how to build software, so let's work together. And I can, yes, definitely write some code, but not as efficient that a software engineer can, because they have a lot of these design patterns already well defined, how to solve some software problems. So but the challenge was that right, as a software company, uh, when they hire software engineers, those software engineers normally are kind of, they work on kind of the core of the business, like we're talking about the game itself, and, and the game service.
Right.
So it was very difficult to attract software engineers that wanted to work in the automation side. uh,
Yeah. Most of the
so
developer I know, what makes it fun for them is the new features, right? Like
mhm.
the new stuff and what they could do, and that would show up in like customers' screen versus the infrastructure on the back end. It really takes a special DevOps
Mhm.
leaning developer to find those things fun and to work
Yeah,
with you.
yeah. And what I noticed as well is that they want to be part of creating something. They want to be part
Yeah.
of, at the end, something that people use, right? And only that can be internal use, can be external use, depending where your passion is. So, so selling a vision, is important. So for me, it was kind of okay. I need to lay down, something that is going to be a, a, a very strong foundation. Get someone that will be interested. That's what I found, or when I was talking with Ben, at that point he was interested to help
Mhm.
on that project. So
How many
uh,
people did you talk to before you hit like you land on awesome band?
I think I spoke with a few engineers and obviously with managers and other teams, and definitely there was some extent of support and help
Yeah.
on for example, when I was looking into, okay, how do I do this Jenkins thing, because I have to
Right.
now write kind of a pipeline kind of instruction in JavaScript. Okay, I haven't done any of that before, so
Right.
I team up with someone that explained, but at the end they have to do it, at least in with bubble gum and
There's
and
some
things
duct
here.
tapes.
Yeah, exactly. uh, but it worked for the purpose of building a prototype that helped me get more support from leadership to get, for example, a software engineer assigned to the project, right? So
Right. I mean, not only do they have to be interested, they have to be allocated cycles. So then
yeah,
somebody would say, you don't have to work on this, feature of, I don't know, keeping up scores, but you're helping Jimbo there doing the automation
yeah.
stuff, the pipeline.
The other part was important is that uh, this is kind of effort. It's not like one time effort at the end of the day. I mean, yeah, maybe you say the MVP. Okay, this is the amount of effort you need to do. But when you start putting together kind of a roadmap,
Yeah.
then you know that the software engineer need to become part of the team that actually keep those systems moving and adding more features, right?
Right.
Um, in some point, my goal was more to identify those features and having that um, channel with the customer, which I am as well. I was kind of part of the customer, but at the same time, I didn't want to set things biased, or my kind of decision just biased by my own understanding. So that's what you need to build this relationship with the network engineers and the people that are using the system, and so you can start, you know, properly prioritizing what is needed.
Yeah.
I I mean, right organization is around the globe, right? They have people in Dublin, they have people in Sydney. So obviously, I was making myself as available as possible to all these different time zones during that project, just because passionate I felt like about this problem space, and in order to get, a solution to the team.
That's funny. You were following the sun, not
I
not
was,
the
yes.
other way around.
In
Usually when we
many,
say
yeah,
follow the
in
sun.
many cases, yes. And the team was really patient with, with me in that perspective.
Yeah.
We knew that there were some bugs associated and issues, and we tried to tackle them. But again, I think that, team composition is something. It's funny because Riot, when you see games like League of Legends, and this is a very competitive game,
Right.
and you hear all these things like, oh, team composition, you have support, you have the jungle, the different kind of League of Legends characters, and it basically translates to this kind of play where you need a good team composition.
Right.
um, there are other areas of operation that, for example, you may want to have data science or data, these data folks that understand how to deal with data, right?
Right.
uh, so I think that part is one of the things that, in any project, that if I have to get involved, I definitely would like to build those relationships with other skills, with other people that have those skills, in order to increase the possibility of success of that project. Right?
Yeah. So I'm sorry. It's kind of my fault. So I brought up the presentation that I did, but I didn't really explain like an overview for people who haven't seen it. So basically, Jaime actually did a presentation on how CI/CD for network, you know, life cycle was done at Riot. So that was the end state. But we went back to the beginning of, how he got the idea and how he kind of perfect that process. So, he mentioned communication, right? For the other team, you build a relationship, you feel passionate about a project. So you were like this internal cheerleader. And then, of course, Riot already have this built-in culture of collaboration. And that's
Yeah,
where you were mentioning last about, because they have this like gaming collaboration mindset and data scientists with developers, it makes it a little bit easier for you to say network engineering and having that collaboration with developers and management.
yeah. I mean, totally. And I mean, to add to that is and there's already a different system in place that they already using, like, GitHub for source control,
Right.
Jenkins, Docker, uh, and at the end of the day, I leveraged all those systems that were in place. I didn't want to, I mean, obviously, I have to understand how these things are, tied together. Uh, but I think the one of the biggest, in terms of time, because time is important, like how fast you can deliver something.
Yeah.
Uh, it was extremely important to work with those teams, and figure out, like, hey, this, I want to do this. How can you help me, right?
How
And
long did it take you to like each of these steps? Like which one did it take you longest? I mean, you already mentioned Jenkins, and there's also, like a learning curve for yourself to learn those that you feel comfortable enough.
mm,
How long did it take you to actually go from having an idea to actually having a prototype?
I think the idea, um, I try to put this in time frames. But
Sure,
yeah,
just
the idea
roughly.
was there for some time. They were like, yeah, we want to embrace infrastructure as code, right?
Yeah.
And how that's how the Riot delivered, software at the end of the day. And I think it took me maybe a couple of months to put a prototype. but everything
Mm.
happened really, really fast because and like all the stars starting aligning. I
Yeah.
remember, I remember. I don't know if I have that book right here. Yeah, I have that book. This network or probability and automation. So I started reading that book and gave me a
Okay.
lot of good, content about the basics. But then the DevNet uh, um was scheduled, and I say, okay, let me go to DevNet and start talking with other people, trying to understand the CI/CD pipeline. Um, I remember I'm seeing this presentation from. Let me tell you who you were at DevNet.
Sure.
Um, mm, 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 mm. I just saw Preston.
Oh, okay. Hank Preston.
Yes, yeah. So it gave me a lot of good, information that I needed to, because sometimes just to wrap this idea in your head, right? So you
Yeah.
can then build this mental model of what you want to do, and not only that, so you can explain it in a passionate way to leadership and others, so they can buy in the idea, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so it took me, so that was like maybe 2 months for the prototype, and then I think working with Ben, that was kind of a 3 month kind of time frame
Hmm.
uh, to move it that to kind of production state, right?
Yeah. So
Um,
it almost takes as long as um working, like what I'm saying is it's almost as important to build relationship and communication to for the stars to align, but once everything's lined up, that's just, like that's half of the story. The other
yeah,
half was just these human, like layer 8, layer 9.
yeah, because there's another part of the whole when you start dealing with, okay, what technology I'm planning to use. Okay, we're going to use, we have a GitHub repo, we have to uh, kind of have these hooks with Jenkins,
Yeah.
and we have to write the own code to actually render configs and do it in a way that makes sense how we define our device models. So the configuration, because that was the other part that people tend to build a lot of abstraction. Okay,
Yeah.
and I think abstraction is great. uh, but when you're working with network engineers that are being configured like BGP, and to configure BGP, they have all these different config steps, right?
Yeah.
I thought, or my conclusion was, I think they will feel more comfortable if they see a model of the config, for example, in a YAML that mimic in some way one to one what is in the config, but only obviously the elements that we need, right? We don't need to have all the possible configuration of BGP in part of the YAML. We only need these particular elements,
Hmm.
attributes.
Okay.
So that's how we decide, okay, we're not doing much abstraction. And the only abstraction that we decide to do is things like, okay, this interface, external interface, or this interface, a backbone interface. And when you define those basically inherit some particular attributes. Part of, external interface need to have an ACL, for example, right?
Yeah.
If it doesn't have an ACL, that should be basically fail some testing or process, steps in the moving forward. So,
Jaime,
uh,
that's let me ask you back to your point about have making the network engineer more comfortable, right? So are you saying instead of being more declarative, like how Ansible is moving toward this declarative state where it's
mhm,
like, okay, BGP true, instead of
mhm,
doing like config t, BGP, ASN, whatever,
mhm.
it's BGP true. But in order for you to push it forward to make it more aligned with CLI, you have it more procedural. You intentionally make the steps like this is what a network engineer would do in CLI, as opposed to having more
Yeah,
abstraction and just say
yes,
declarative.
yes. That's what
I
kind
s-
of the my conclusion at that point.
got it.
Obviously, this is one of those things you don't know how if if that was the best choice or not.
Yeah,
But in my mind, I thought, okay, if I want to do abstraction, I can do in a different layer. I can do, for example, a tool that give me that abstraction, right? In terms like
yeah,
I have, and not only that, I can maybe encourage engineers to that want to participate to write those tools. Like I want to write a tool that build peering BGP peers, right? And
Yeah.
he will grab information from PeerDB and will grab information from our internal system to see if it worth peering with that AS. Uh, and then they that basically spill out this YAML that I'm expecting to receive from the system, right?
Right.
So that was the thought process. Instead of like spending a lot of time on figuring out what the abstraction should looks like or how much abstraction we should have from day one,
Yeah.
um, and maybe failing down the road that people may engineers would say, "Oh, I just," because that's the thing. Like, and to me, that's kind of a trap. Like, oh, for to confirm this, I only need to specify like, oh, BGP, as you say, BGP true, right?
Yeah.
And they don't know what's going on in the back end, what's pushed to the config, and
Yeah.
the moment that they need to troubleshoot that or troubleshoot the device, they see they don't have no clue what's configured on the device, right?
Yeah, and then you kind of lose that point, right? Then you still go back to that single point of failure for the person who understands the abstraction
Yeah.
becomes that bottleneck.
Yeah.
Versus if you put everything procedural, then network engineer who are familiar with the CLI could already tell what's going
Yes.
on and
Yes.
more easily.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That is very interesting. I guess if you're defining abstraction yourself, then that makes sense. But so for me, right, like when I touch Jenkins,
Hmm.
I would say I just used because Jenkins is all about plugins, right?
Hmm.
Or like external
Yeah.
third party softwares, right? So plugins. And so what I usually do is just write Ansible playbook and
Mhm.
use like shell plugin to execute this Ansible playbook. But as you said, that requires that person who knows Ansible, right? If you end up
Yeah.
with a network engineer who's more of a familiar with CLI, then all he or she executes Ansible, then something breaks, you still have to go back to that person who understands Ansible.
Yeah. And again, uh, at least in my head, it makes sense. Like, okay, let's do it like this. And I
Right.
think the engineers actually that helped them kind of embrace it. And
Hmm.
also, I I, I believe that there was the because now they want to, okay, I want to build this other tool. I want to maybe create a tool that build the pops,
Yeah.
or to deploy new backbone circuits, etc. So,
Right.
uh, and they knew that they need to spill up the output of their tool need to be this device YAML, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, my job was as well or part of the vision was, okay, I need to have some kind of um validation. Whatever they spill out, I need to validate that is compliant with the model, right?
Right.
And we start working with this is something I didn't mention, but in some point because Ben was moving to another company, I felt like, okay, I need some level of support from software engineer for someone, and I start engaging network to code, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So and we will start working together with network to code, and they bring like a lot of expertise on how to do some things, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, we still own the vision and most of the only the day-to-day operation of the system, etc. But they help us kind of delivering some feature faster. I would say,
Mm,
right? And
yeah.
one of those things was like validating like YAML files or in terms of JSON using JSON schemas.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, this was kind of the how we one of the I think the key components of getting this to a point where engineers feel comfortable with working with, right?
I think that's a fantastic insight because you wouldn't know this you wouldn't know this unless you actually done it, right? Like to me, from if I would put on my developer hat, I would have think that more abstraction would have been better because that's what, like, there's fewer lines of code, there's fewer things to worry about. But in practice, unless you actually done it and unless you come from a network engineering background who needs this human layer of buy-ins of the rest of your team, the reverse is actually true. You actually have to have less abstraction for people to adapt this tool. Then once they adapt it, then collectively they could decide whether more abstraction is better or not. So I think,
Yeah, I believe so.
yeah, I think that's a great insight. And this is one of those area where human relationship and human interaction trumps technical superiority, right? Like
Mm.
we could discuss the technical bits and pieces until we're red in the face, but unless people buys in and use it, this is just not going to go anywhere. And I think that's kind of the pitfalls of a lot of the companies who've tried to adapt it. They try to have the best practices and whatever is perhaps being used by, I don't know, like being advertised or being preached by Google and Facebook, and they have tons of developers and all the resources in the world,
Hmm.
but but you're not Google. Like if you're an enterprise of with two engineers, like you don't have the same problem. So you really have to take these real world experience and advices and think of human buy-ins first before you know go ahead and chase down like quote unquote industry best practices.
Yeah, and the well, I put a lot of thought on this part, to be honest.
Yeah, I could tell.
And
You
no,
still remember 2 years after.
the thing, like, I saw different system, and I totally see why they did it, like the way like, oh, this abstraction, and to me, even when I was trying to understand one of these systems in more detail, it just took me so much energy to unwrap all this abstraction to a point that I could understand what's going on, right?
Yeah,
And at the end, I say, you may call it like, okay, I mean, I made that part of that decision. Always, I'm limiting resources, I'm limiting time. I believe that if I lay down a foundation, we can work in abstraction in a different way. And to
right.
me, it was kind of a, maybe we can develop some Python libraries that basically you can import your design, models, right? Like this is a backbone interface to have MTU 9000, for example, or whatever design choices you made.
Yeah,
That basically is part of the in your Python library. And when people start developing a tool that going to provision, a backbone circuit, then he automatically have all these validation in your as part of your code, etc. Right? Um, so that's why I think, okay, and we get to some point to that because I personally wrote some tools, and in order to show the rest engineers the power of that, I brought some kind of very like early version of these libraries, right?
yeah,
That has these design or design standards as part of these inherent in those libraries. So people cannot make mistakes, right?
r-
They cannot write a line of code with a tool that will provision backbone circuit and leave the MTU different than 9000, for example. Okay.
yeah,
Uh, Now, again, this kind of for me was kind of, I'm okay experiencing the experimenting. If there's something that we need to change, we change it, right?
right.
Uh, but uh, but it's very important to have that close loop with the engineer and say what things are working, what things are not working, and we make it. We adapt to that, right?
Yeah, I like that. So I think the first thing that you mentioned was, um, correct me if I'm wrong, but just speaking from a user's perspective, right? Like you when you design your system, you really put yourself into the user's perspective, your customer. In this case, is internal, your network engineer peers.
Yeah.
So you
Mhm.
have to come from their perspective. You know, their adaptation is the most important thing.
Yeah.
So you design a system that encourages them to leverage their existing knowledge, use that system, and then you quickly iterate, right? Like that's the second part you brought up is we could change this, and you brought in your code that is on a simplified form, and just to show them the capability, and then you guys all talk about it. So I think that's super important. Like I said, this is the kind of real world experience that you wouldn't get unless you spend a lot of time thinking and a lot of time validating and experimenting. And it turns out, you were pretty successful in doing that, right?
Well, I would. I mean, the success depends on the um, having at least being open to get have this conversation with other people and working with smart folks around, and because and be open on those conversations. I One thing I learned from those is um, I don't I don't know better. It's more like let's find out what is better, right?
Yeah,
For between I mean between a group of individuals working in these kind of challenges.
yeah,
Um, so that's the part I do enjoy. Yeah, obviously there's some technology choices you made, but at the end of the day, the part that I enjoy the most is getting to a point where people feel okay. This is a good start. Let's keep working and get people even excited, right?
yeah,
Uh, to a point that they want to participate, they want to be more involved, and they want to be actually in the way that uh, improve the system itself, right? Even if
yeah.
they didn't start from the beginning. So
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that saying where if you want to go fast, you could go alone, but if you want to go far, you got to go in a team, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
you got to go
yeah. Good point.
together, and so if you speak from that, like if you want to build something that is going to last, then you have to get people's buy-in, and as you've mentioned, let's just stay humble, leave the ego at the door. Let's work together. Even though we'll just make a decision and we'll quickly iterate if it's not the right one, but we have to go somewhere, we have to start somewhere. So why don't we just start from there, and then getting people's adaptation is the most important thing. That's
Yeah.
very Silicon Valley and startup B of you, right? You bring a
Uh,
prototype, you quickly iterate, and then you get people's buy-in. You always, sometimes the first MVP is for held together by bubble gums and duct tapes, but open people's mind and open their imagination, and they could correlate and say, okay, I can make that mental leap, even though I know this is raw and premature, but I can make that mental leap that this is how it's going to be in the future. I could see it. And then they get
you know,
excited and start using it.
I mean, I was surprised that the prototype actually worked when I first, well, because I was dealing with things like Jenkins, and
Yeah.
API calls between these things, and yeah, so yeah, it was interesting. The other thing, like one of the other challenges was the engineers were not very comfortable with Git and that process, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Source control and how many? I mean, the amount of time that engineers reach out to me. Hey, I think I cannot. Every time I try to push this, he says conflict with the branch. I say,
Yeah.
okay, okay, and work on start kind of learning even myself, like okay, what rebase is doing
Oh my
and
God.
all that.
Rebase.
Yeah,
Oh,
and all those little things, right? That how you
yeah.
actually you don't need to become a Git expert. Obviously, it's very good to know someone that have a very good understanding of that
Yeah.
because they can take you out of the hole if you get in the hole. But at the end, we learn like, okay, this is safe. I mean, if my local branch is messed up, I just going to I can just delete it and I
Yeah.
just going to clone it again
Yeah.
and I start fresh from whatever is in the master, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
people need to know how to fail safe, right?
yeah,
Like when things comes. So I think the same thing with people who's using Vim, for example, right? Like that's my editor of choice. But
mm,
people using Vim is always afraid, like they'll make some changes and all that. And I think the first thing that would comfort them down, calm their nerve down, is you could always just discard your changes and get out, and then you're
yeah,
back from step one, right? Like that's the
yeah,
worst case scenario.
yeah,
Don't worry about if you make 1,000 different steps and you mess up the original. That's okay. Just get out. So I think in this case, you were saying the best part about it is you're teaching people how to fail safe on with all things. Worst comes to worst, you just discard all of your local changes, just reclone it again.
yeah. And there were other cases where someone start working in a new branch because they were planning some major changes
Yeah,
and a week later there was like multiple merged to master and now they're out of their branch is way behind
yeah,
so they need to And sometimes they rebase, and there's all these conflicts, and say how I deal with conflicts.
Yeah.
And when GitHub may, or in this case, may solve some of these conflicts, sometimes it cannot, and you need to figure that out. And I think that's the part that engineers were not very comfortable at the beginning, and maybe even today some of them are not comfortable with. Uh, but I believe that's something that is inevitable to learn uh, about it. If you're going to get into the infrastructure as code, and you have, as I'm going to say, a big team, but more than two people, you will need to figure out and learn how to deal with uh, conflict. And these conflicts are simple, just like a line in the config on the YAML file that maybe was changed, or that section was changed by someone else, and GitHub couldn't figure out, okay, this is a conflict here, right?
Yeah, you guys duel it out. You call
Yeah,
pick up the phone and say, "Hey, Jimbo, why did you delete that BGP? Was it really necessary,
yeah. So
or was it a mistake?" And then you figure it out, and and go on your merry ways.
and I think one thing that people don't realize, or engineers don't realize until they start working in this kind of system, is I call it during my presentation kind of a high definition of the changes, like in terms of
Okay,
looking at our changes in high definition. Basically, when you look into the history of a file, right, and this file is an interface of a device, you can see in time with very detail, like, oh, this day this line changed, right, this
right,
BGP changed the IP address, or whatever the description of the interface changed, and that change was done by this engineer,
yeah,
in this commit,
accountability,
right?
right?
Yeah, accountability, etc. So because I mean, I guess you can have some of that when you have TACAC and on all these
Oh no,
systems tied together,
that's
right?
gonna be much
But
harder, man.
but this level is just very clean, right? It's just
Yeah,
very nice to see, uh, and not to blame anyone, because
yeah,
that's the other thing. Like, we're doing this in order to understand. Oh, we make this change because, and if you follow some good practices, and you will have some well described, information on those commits. uh, Only you will know what is the context behind it. Like, someone
right,
changed this because blah blah blah, right?
yeah,
Uh, so that encourage the team actually to actually collaborate even better, in my opinion. So
yeah.
uh,
That's almost where everything has to start, right? Like you have to have a source control system in order to have accountability, in order to have history of
mhm,
tracking, and everything starts from there. If you want to revert your changes, or if you want to build like actual CI/CD pipeline,
mhm,
everything has to start from there. I think the only thing that I would kind of change in that story is Jenkins, man. Like, I mean, I've used Jenkins. I know it's not a choice. It's not up to us, right? Like, we all have things that company standards that we have to adhere to. But if I were to choose, I think even Hank, when he did his presentation,
mhm,
I want to say he used drones, right? So you have like drones as your
mhm,
like Jenkins replacement, because that's a little bit easier. And then he talked to the callback in GitHub, and then you have some runners that register to the drones. And for me, when I did my course in the
mhm.
for LinkedIn Learning, I actually use GitLab
Well,
because
that's what I'm using right now in my
yeah,
current project.
yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, for me, Jenkins is Java based. It's kind of slow. You end up maintaining different packages. I mean, I don't hate it. I just think they're probably more modern tools out there,
Mm,
and that kind of mimics my day job too. Like we started with Jenkins, and we end up using GitLab and using a hosted version and so on. Yeah, so I think they're, and that's after I chose GitLab. I really like GitLab and how they integrated together. You would think that maybe you want to have the system and the runner separately, but there are certain advantages in having them combined, I
mhm.
think.
Well, I think, I mean, that's what I'm looking right now, and at the end of the day, to me, obviously, it depends what the company is already using, right?
Exactly,
and
exactly.
and and the thing that I can leverage expertise from people inside that. that already done or working with that system, say, hey, I'm stuck here. How do I deal with this situation? And only when you go all rogue, then you're going to deal with other problems, right?
Yeah, yeah. You
uh,
have to justify your choice and
yeah,
explain to
exactly,
people why you chose GitLab instead of
exactly.
what the
So
rest of the company is using.
yeah, so I mean, and I believe there's going to be some strong, you know, argument to see this is better than what the company using, but at the same time, there's, as you say, there's have to be very strong arguments, uh, so you can be that exception. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, back to that communication and adaptation, right? Like it's already adapted. So, if you go against the current, it's just going to be a longer pull. You're going to be spending most of your time convincing people as opposed to doing the stuff that really matters. So you might as
Yeah.
well just go with it, have adaptation and move on from there. And if there's something down the line that needs to be changed, then there's always time for that. But right now it's more important to get things going.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Jaime, I want to ask you. I mean, this is two parts of the same interview, but we're coming up on time. But I want to ask you one last question on how do you think people get started with network automation, in your opinion?
Um, well, obviously, they have to be. I I think the most important part is that there's something that actually you want truly add that skill set to your tool belt, right?
Okay.
And if one thing, if the company say, I need you to work in this, but you're not have no passion about it,
Yeah.
then I don't think you will get the best quality out of that work, right? I
But
think
how do
the
you get
best,
that passion though? Like, what do you get the desire and motivation, if not just for like, oh, extra 10% extra pay?
obviously, to me, it was dealing with this kind of problem in a daily basis, right? In different
Mm,
companies, in my experience, and I think I don't want to deal with that in that way. And um, I want to embrace other, paradigms that make more sense to me. And obviously, in my in previous life, I did I did enjoy writing code. I was I never got to a point where to get good at it, or enough experience to be face do work face to I don't know in terms of com- I don't want to say compete, but a software engineer have that have been working in this writing software obviously have a lot of knowledge that I cannot generate at this point in my career. But
sure.
um, so yeah, obviously you need to be passionate about networking. You need to be feel passionate about writing software, writing code, and obviously solving problems.
Yeah.
And the other part of the I think is critical is to you need to be able to have this conversation with people that will have a totally different perspective than yours, right?
Okay.
And and have and use that in your advantage in terms of using that, because at the moment that you are open to those conversations, and you may think, okay, I may not be right on this particular idea, is when things start getting even in a better place, right?
Yeah.
um, but again, my passion in terms of only, there's always going to be, okay, you need to learn a language, you need to learn the concepts. You're going to be working in an environment that require a lot of DevOps kind of, there's a lot of training
Yeah.
around the concept ideas these days. Everything is in but you also need to be critical about the information that you're receiving, right? Just not receive and say, okay, that's basically the new truth or whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
You need to look at yourself and learn how what information is maybe useful for you at that point. Maybe in the future, you don't know, it will hit you. I'm pretty sure, like, this makes sense. Maybe not now, but maybe in the future, right?
Connecting the dots later on back
Yeah,
to what
yeah,
I like how
yeah.
you always circle back to your central idea, right? Like your central idea of if I summarize or if I hear you correctly, is you find a problem set that you feel passionate about, and the second is be receptive of different points of view, right? Like be
Hmm. Yeah,
open-minded. and then the third was to be able to, what was the third one that you mentioned? So
Oh,
be passionate about, and then be receptive, and then find the right resources, right?
yeah.
You mentioned
Hmm.
find the
Yes.
right resources, and you could always connect the dots later. It may not make sense to you now if you just consume the resource, but it might make sense for you in a bit.
Yeah, because I do believe that your brain is, I mean, even if that doesn't make sense to you right now, but your brain's still working.
Yeah,
Our brain's always working, and they are going to be, as you said, they are going to connect those dots in some point, right?
yeah. It, like, literally, right? Your brain's
Yeah,
full of neurons, and but the
yeah,
pathways are always not always connected. Your
yeah,
neurons, the more you work the neurons, the more pathway is gonna connect, and literally you're gonna, like, the more connection you have, the more likely chances of like a shortcut happening that you may not connect now, but it's like one day you'll wake up and like that
yeah.
dot's gonna
Or in the
connect.
middle of the night, right? The middle of the night. Oh, now I know how to solve that problem, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
like
and when you're
that.
passionate, you will wake up, you will stand up, and you will turn on your computer, and you're going to start, doing something. That happened to me many times when I was working this project. Like, oh, now I figured out this thing, right? And I didn't want to leave it to next day. But again, everybody's different.
Yeah,
It has to be like, if there's something that you're really passionate about, like that, you will spend the time to solve those problems.
man, if I lose any more sleep than I already do now, I have even less hair, man. For people who
uh,
are not watching, Jaime has this beautiful, very wise guy looking, like, full white hair, and which is like the jealous. I'm jealous of that. But
oh man,
anyhow,
you see,
um,
man, it's all white now.
no, it's silver, man. It's like Sean Connery silver.
Oh,
But but
oh crap.
anyways, hey Jaime, it's always good to chat with you. But
Yeah,
I
buddy.
truly enjoy our
Likewise.
conversation. Thank you for put up with my these mistakes on my
Nah, nah.
very first in person. I'm glad we get to catch up. So can you tell us how to find you on social, or if you're even on social at all?
I mean, I am. I mean, obviously, uh, in terms of linking, I mean, you can always ping me there. I will. I normally connect with everybody that want to talk
Sure.
about or build a relationship around these topics,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
The
Okay.
the but yeah, I mean, definitely, it's not that I actively, uh, putting things in Twitter or anything like that. Is uh, kind of very informal on that.
Yeah.
How we, I I guess I share those
Okay.
connections.
Yeah, sure. So you're not a social butterfly, but you typically connect with people on LinkedIn. So we'll include those in the show notes. We'll actually include the book that you mentioned, and also Hank's presentation on CI/CD, which I believe I've saw it a few times, not a few times, but I've seen it before. And I mean, since we're all there, I may have even been there in person. I just don't recall. I know I watched the recording, so Hank is excellent, and I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from Jaime. So thanks again, Jaime, for being on the show.
Oh, we're learning from you, buddy. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. All right. Take care. Thanks for listening to Network Automation Nerds podcast. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other podcast player platforms. Until next time. Bye bye.